Hey there. Welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk about something that touches everyday life in a very quiet, very gradual way. We're going to talk about why prices rise. Why the things you buy today cost more than they did a few years ago, and why that has been true for most of human history. We're not going to rush through it. We're going to take our time, move slowly, and let the ideas settle in at their own pace. So get comfortable. Find a position that feels right. And just let this wash over you gently, the way a long, slow explanation tends to do when nobody's in a hurry to get anywhere. There's a lot to cover, but none of it needs to feel heavy. This is one of those topics that seems complicated at first, and then gradually, as you sit with it, it starts to feel almost obvious. Like something that was always there, just waiting to be noticed. So let's ease in. You've probably noticed it in some small, ordinary way. Maybe you went to buy something you've bought many times before. A cup of coffee or a loaf of bread or a tank of gas, and the price was a little higher than you remembered. Not dramatically higher, maybe. Just a little. Enough to make you pause for a second. Enough to make you think, I'm sure that used to be cheaper. And then you paid it anyway, because what else do you do, and went on with your day. That small moment, that quiet pause, is actually the beginning of a very old and very interesting story. Because prices have been rising, in one form or another, for about as long as human civilization has existed. Not always quickly. Not always in ways people noticed right away. But the general drift, over time, has been upward. And understanding why that happens, really understanding it, involves tracing back through layers of history and economics and human behavior that are all quietly connected to each other. The word people use for this is inflation. It's one of those words that gets thrown around a lot, often in ways that make it sound either simple or scary, depending on who's using it. But underneath the word is something much more interesting than it might seem. It's a story about what money is and what it does, about how societies organize the exchange of things, about the relationship between the amount of money floating around and the amount of stuff that money can buy. And it goes back a long way. Let's start where things are now and work our way gently backward. Because sometimes the easiest way to understand how something got to where it is to start at the end and slowly unravel how it got there. Right now, in the modern world, prices are set in money. That seems obvious, almost too obvious to say. But it's worth sitting with for a moment, because money is doing a very specific job here. It's acting as a common unit of value. When a loaf of bread costs $2 and a pair of shoes costs $60, what that's really saying is that in the current system of exchange, shoes are worth about 30 loaves of bread. The dollar is just a measuring stick. It's the thing that lets you compare the value of a loaf of bread to the value of a pair of shoes even though they have nothing to do with each other. Now, here's the gentle first question to sit with. What determines how long that measuring stick actually is? If the measuring stick gets shorter, everything it measures looks bigger. If you used to measure a room and got 20 feet, and then the definition of a foot quietly changed so that it was only 11 inches instead of 12, The same room would now measure about 21.5 feet. Nothing about the room changed. Only the measuring tool changed. And this, in a very slow and simplified way, is part of what happens with inflation. The measuring stick, the dollar, the pound, the euro, whichever currency you're using, changes in its effective length over time. As more money exists in the economy, each individual unit of it becomes slightly less powerful. And so prices, measured in those units, drift upward. But that explanation is only one piece of the picture. And it's actually one of the more recent pieces, historically speaking. To understand the fuller story, we need to step back quite a bit further. Let's go back to what it means to be in an economy at all. An economy, at its most basic level, is just people exchanging things. You have something I want. I have something you want. We trade. That's it. That's the kernel of the whole thing. And for a very long time in human history, that was essentially how it worked. You grew wheat. I made clay pots. You needed a pot. I needed grain. We figured out how many pots were worth how much grain, and we swapped. This is called barter, and it works reasonably well in small, closely connected communities where everyone knows everyone and everyone knows what everyone else has. If the village is small enough and the relationships are stable enough, you can keep track of who owes what to whom, and things more or less balance out over time. But barter has a fundamental limitation that becomes more and more noticeable as communities grow. The limitation is called the double coincidence of wants. In order to make a trade, both parties have to want exactly what the other one has, at exactly the same time. You have to want my clay pot at the exact moment that I want your wheat. And that's fine when there are only 50 people in your community. But as communities grow, as people start specializing more, as you have weavers and metalworkers and tanners and farmers all producing different things, the chances of any two people happening to want exactly what the other has, at exactly the right moment, gets smaller and smaller. So what do? What humans figured out, independently in many different parts of the world, was that you could use something as an intermediary. Instead of swapping your wheat directly for my clay pots, you could swap your wheat for something that everyone agreed had value, and then later swap that thing for the clay pots. The something could be almost anything, as long as everyone in your community agreed to accept it. In different parts of the world and in different periods of history, this role was played by an enormous variety of objects. Shells were used as currency in parts of Africa, China, and the Pacific Islands for thousands of years. Dried fish served as a medium of exchange in Iceland well into the medieval period. Livestock, particularly cattle, functioned as a store of value in many early societies, which is why the words for cattle and capital share a common root in Latin. Salt was traded as currency along the ancient salt roads of Africa and Europe, and for a long time Roman soldiers were paid partly in salt, which is where the word salary comes from. Blocks of tea pressed together were used as money in Central Asia. Cacao beans served as currency among the Aztecs. Feathers, beads, cloth, metal tools, all of these things have at various points in history served the function of money. What all of these things have in common is that they were generally agreed upon by a community to be worth something. They were portable enough to be carried around. They were durable enough to last more than a few days. They were divisible enough, or came in enough different sizes, to represent different amounts of value. And they were scarce enough that you couldn't just go and make unlimited quantities of them yourself. That last quality, scarcity, is crucial, and it's directly connected to why prices rise. Here's a gentle way to think about it. Imagine a small island community that uses dried fish as money. There are 100 fish coins in circulation. The island produces 10 baskets of fruit per season, and those 10 baskets of fruit, sold for all the fish coins in the economy, would naturally settle at a price of about 10 fish coins per basket. Not because anyone decided that, just because that's how supply and demand find their balance. Now imagine that the fishing gets much better one season. Suddenly there are 200 fish coins in the island's economy. The amount of fruit hasn't changed. There are still 10 baskets. But now there are twice as many fish coins chasing the same 10 baskets. What happens to the price of a basket of fruit? It tends to drift upward, toward 20 fish coins per basket. Because there's more money than there was before, and it's all trying to buy the same amount of stuff. The fruit hasn't become more valuable in any absolute sense. It's the same fruit, grown the same way, tasting the same. But its price, measured in fish coins, has doubled. The measuring stick got shorter. Each fish coin is now worth half of what it used to be, because there are twice as many of them and the same amount of fruit to buy. This is, in its most stripped-down form, the core mechanism of inflation. Too much money chasing too few goods. It sounds almost simple when you put it that way. And in some ways it is simple. But the reason inflation has been one of the most studied, most debated, and most stubbornly present features of economic life for thousands of years is that the real world is never quite as simple as 10 baskets of fruit on a small island. In the real world, the supply of goods isn't fixed. It changes constantly, with the seasons, with technology, with trade routes opening and closing, with wars and droughts and discoveries. The supply of money changes too, and not always in ways that are easy to predict or control. And the relationship between the supply of money and the prices of things is mediated by 1,000 other factors, including how quickly money moves through the economy, how confident people feel about the future, what's happening with wages, what's happening with production costs, and whether the people who are setting prices are doing so in competition with many other sellers or in a position to charge whatever they like. All of those threads are woven together. And to really understand where inflation comes from, it helps to understand how each of those threads developed historically. Let's step back a little further into the world of metal coins. At some point in various ancient societies, people discovered that certain metals had some uniquely useful properties for serving as money. Gold and silver, in particular, are dense, durable, shiny, and cannot be created synthetically. You can't grow gold in a field. You can't catch it in a net. You have to dig it out of the ground, which takes a lot of work, which means that the supply of it is naturally limited. It won't rot or rust. It can be divided into smaller and smaller pieces without losing its essential nature. It's the same wherever you find it, whether you dig it up in Egypt or Spain or West Africa. These qualities made gold and silver almost ideal monetary metals. The Lydians, living in what is now Western Turkey, are generally credited with producing the first true coins sometime around the 7th century BC. Though there's considerable debate about this, and other early coinage appeared in roughly similar periods in India and China as well. The idea of a coin was straightforward. Take a standardized weight of precious metal, stamp it with an official mark to certify its weight and purity, and use that as money. The advantage of coins over earlier commodity money was significant. You didn't have to weigh out your salt or count your shells every time you made a purchase. The government or the authority issuing the coins had already done that for you. A coin of a certain denomination was a coin of a certain denomination. That certainty made trade easier and faster. But here's where something interesting begins. Once a government has the power to issue coins, it also has the power to change what those coins contain. And governments throughout history have had a persistent tendency to need more money than they have. Wars are expensive. Building roads and temples and palaces is expensive. Paying soldiers and administrators and workers is expensive. And when a government runs low on funds, one tempting solution is to stretch the supply of money. And one very old way to do that was to quietly reduce the precious metal content of the coins. This practice is called debasement, and it was extraordinarily common in the ancient and medieval world. The way it typically worked was that the government would recall old coins, melt them down, add a cheaper metal like copper or tin to the mixture, and then recast them as the same denomination. You'd put in 10 grams of silver and get out a coin that contained only 8 grams of silver, with the other 2 grams made up of cheaper material. The face value of the coin stayed the same, but its actual content decreased. Rome is one of the most thoroughly documented examples of this. The Roman silver coin, the denarius, was introduced in the late 3rd century BC and was initially nearly pure silver. Over the centuries that followed, as the empire expanded, as military expenses mounted, as various crises demanded more and more spending, the silver content of the denarius was gradually reduced. By the time of Nero in the 1st century CE, the silver content had dropped to about 90%. By the 3rd century, it had fallen to perhaps 5% or even less. The coin was barely silver at all. It was mostly bronze with a thin silver wash. And what happened to prices during this period? They rose. Merchants who had been doing business for decades, who knew perfectly well what a denarius used to buy, learned the hard way that a coin with much less silver in it was worth much less in terms of purchasing power. They adjusted their prices upward to compensate. A bag of grain that used to cost 1 denarius might now cost 3 or 5 or 10, not because grain had become scarcer, but because the coin had become less valuable. The people who suffered most from this were ordinary Romans. Soldiers whose pay was denominated in debased coins found their real wages falling even as the numbers stayed nominally the same. Fixed income earners, people who were owed set amounts of money regardless of what happened to prices, found that their incomes bought less and less. Landlords who had signed long-term leases at fixed rates were effectively receiving a smaller real payment every year as prices climbed. This experience, or variations of it, repeated itself in different societies throughout history. The story of governments creating money and that money losing value is not a modern invention. It is as old as money itself. But let's hold that thought for a moment and look at another thread. Alongside the question of how much money there is in an economy is the question of how quickly that money is moving. Economists have a term for this, the velocity of money. And it matters quite a bit for understanding prices. Imagine again our small island with 100 fish coins. But now imagine that most of those fish coins are buried in the ground by a very cautious islander who doesn't trust anyone and never spends them. Even though there are 100 fish coins in existence, only a few of them are actually being used to buy and sell things. The effective money supply in circulation might be much lower than the nominal money supply. And so prices would behave as if there were fewer coins, not more. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine that those same 100 fish coins are changing hands very rapidly, multiple times a day, everyone buying and selling constantly. In that case, the same 100 fish coins are doing much more work than they would if they were sitting still. The effective purchasing power being applied to goods is much higher, and prices would tend to be higher as a result. This is why simply counting the number of coins or banknotes in existence doesn't fully explain why prices are where they are. You also have to think about whether people are actually using that money or hoarding it, how frequently transactions are happening, how confident people feel about spending. And that leads to another piece of the puzzle: expectations. One of the stranger and more fascinating aspects of inflation is that it can become self-reinforcing in a way that has almost nothing to do with the actual supply of money or goods. It has to do with what people expect to happen. Here's a simple version of how it works. Suppose prices have been rising gradually for several years. Workers have been watching their cost of living go up a little bit each year. So the next time they negotiate their wages, they ask for a raise that's a little higher than usual, because they're anticipating that prices will continue to rise. Their employers agree, because they too are expecting prices to rise, which they believe will allow them to pass the higher labor costs on to their customers. So wages go up. And when wages go up, the costs of production go up. And when costs of production go up, prices go up. And when prices go up, workers need a raise. And so on. This is sometimes called a wage price spiral, and it's one of the ways that inflation can take on a life of its own, sustaining itself even when the original cause has passed. The expectation of inflation becomes, in a sense, a cause of inflation. People act as though prices will be higher, and their actions collectively push prices higher, confirming the expectation. It's a loop that can be very difficult to break once it gets going. Central banks, the institutions that manage monetary policy in modern economies, spend a great deal of their effort on managing these expectations. There's a concept called inflation credibility, which is basically the degree to which people believe the central bank when it says it will keep inflation low. If people believe it, They don't preemptively raise wages and prices. If they don't believe it, they start building inflation into all their decisions, and inflation becomes much harder to control. But central banks are a fairly modern invention. Let's step back from them for a moment and trace the thread further back in time, to the period when the economy of the Western world was being remade by a very dramatic expansion of the money supply. In the late 15th and 16th centuries, Spanish explorers arrived in the Americas and discovered not just new lands, but vast quantities of silver and gold. The mines of Potosí in present-day Bolivia, discovered in 1545, were among the richest silver deposits ever found. The Silver Mountain, as Potosí was sometimes called, produced enormous quantities of the metal, which was extracted using forced indigenous and enslaved labor and shipped across the Atlantic to Spain. The scale of this influx of precious metal into the European economy was unlike anything that had happened before. Between roughly 1500 and 1650, the amount of silver and gold in circulation in Europe roughly tripled or perhaps even more than tripled, depending on how you measure it. A continent that had been operating with a relatively tight money supply for centuries suddenly found itself awash in metal. And what happened to prices? They rose dramatically over the course of a century or so. This period is sometimes called the price revolution of the 16th century, and historians and economists have debated its causes and extent for generations. But the broad picture is fairly clear. Across Western Europe, grain prices, wages, and the cost of goods generally increased substantially, perhaps by a factor of 4 or 5 or more over the course of the century. Not all of this was due to the influx of American silver. Population was also growing during this period, and more people meant more mouths to feed and more demand for goods. There were shifts in agricultural productivity. Trade networks were changing. All of these things interacted. But the sudden, enormous increase in the money supply clearly played a major role. The Spanish, who were the immediate recipients of all this metal, experienced some of the worst inflation. Their economy was flooded with silver at the same time that their domestic agricultural production was struggling, and the results were destabilizing in ways that contributed to Spain's long economic decline from its position as Europe's dominant power. A Spanish scholar named Martín de Azpilicueta, writing in 1556, was one of the first people to articulate what later became known as the quantity theory of money, the idea that the value of money is related to how much of it there is, and that flooding an economy with precious metal causes prices to rise. He was essentially describing, in early form, the fish coin island story. More money, same goods, higher prices. This is one of those ideas that seems obvious once you hear it, but which took careful observation and thought to articulate clearly, especially at a time when the mechanisms of economy were not nearly as well understood as they are today. Let's let that settle for a moment and look at another way that prices have historically risen, one that has less to do with money supply and more to do with the costs of producing things. We often think of inflation as a purely monetary phenomenon, a story about money losing its value. But prices can also rise for a very different reason, because it genuinely costs more to make, or grow, or transport the things people want. If a drought destroys a third of the wheat harvest, the price of bread goes up not because there's more money in circulation, but because there's less wheat. If a mine that produces copper starts to run out of easily accessible ore and miners have to dig deeper and work harder to get the same amount, the price of copper goes up because the cost of producing it has genuinely increased. If a new regulation requires factories to treat their wastewater before releasing it, which is a good thing for the environment but adds real costs to the production process, the price of whatever the factory makes tends to go up to cover those new costs. This kind of inflation, driven by genuine increases in the cost of producing goods, is sometimes called cost-push inflation to distinguish it from demand-pull inflation, which is the fish coin version where more money is chasing the same goods. Both can cause prices to rise. Both can happen at the same time, and often do. The oil shocks of the 1970s are one of the most instructive examples of cost-push inflation in modern history. In 1973 and again in 1979, political events in the Middle East led to sharp reductions in the supply of oil available to Western economies and dramatic increases in its price. Oil was and still is woven through almost every aspect of a modern economy. It powers vehicles and machinery. It heats homes. It's a feedstock for plastics and chemicals and fertilizers. When oil prices doubled and then doubled again, the cost of almost everything that involved transportation or manufacturing or heating went up. This wasn't a story of central banks printing too much money. It was a story of a critical input becoming dramatically more expensive, and those costs rippling through the entire economy. The response to cost-push inflation is, in some ways, more difficult to manage than demand-pull inflation. You can, in principle, reduce demand-pull inflation by reducing the money supply, making money scarcer so each unit is worth more. But you can't solve cost-push inflation by tightening monetary policy, at least not without causing significant economic pain, because the price increases are not the result of too much money. They're the result of genuinely higher costs. Reducing the money supply in response to an oil shock just means people have less money to pay for things that are already more expensive, which tends to lead to recession rather than a clean return to stable prices. This tension between different types of inflation and the appropriate policy responses to each is one of the reasons that managing prices is such a persistent challenge for governments and central banks. Let's move along now to another thread, one that is more modern in some ways but also deeply old in its roots. Let's talk about supply chains and what happens when something disrupts them. When you buy something at a store, most of the time you don't think very much about how it got there. It was just there, on the shelf, reasonably priced, available when you wanted it. But behind that moment of simple purchase is often an elaborate and long supply chain that stretches across multiple countries and involves dozens or sometimes hundreds of different companies and processes. A simple metal bolt, the kind used in manufacturing, might involve iron ore mined in Brazil, shipped to a steel plant in South Korea, processed into steel that's transported to a factory in Germany, where it's formed into a bolt, inspected, packaged, and shipped by container vessel to a port in Los Angeles, unloaded by dock workers, transported by truck to a distribution warehouse in Ohio, sorted and sent on to a factory in Michigan that uses it to assemble a machine that eventually ends up in a workshop somewhere. Each step in that chain involves transportation costs, labor costs, storage costs, insurance fees, and some margin of profit for the businesses involved. The remarkable thing about the modern global economy is that all of those steps, strung together, typically produce a final product that is cheaper than it would be if you tried to make the whole thing locally. The efficiency gains from specialization, from making things where they can be made most cheaply, and from the enormous scale of global trade, have held down prices for manufactured goods for decades. But supply chains are also fragile in ways that only become obvious when something goes wrong. When a single large factory in Taiwan that produces a specific type of semiconductor chip had to curtail production due to drought, the impact rippled through the global automobile and electronics industries within months. When a container ship called the Ever Given got stuck sideways in the Suez Canal for 6 days in 2021, it blocked one of the world's most important shipping lanes and contributed to a backup of hundreds of ships that took weeks to fully clear. Small disruptions, compounded through long, tightly calibrated supply chains, can produce surprisingly large price effects. The COVID-19 pandemic was the largest and most dramatic supply chain disruption in modern memory. Factories shut down or reduced capacity. Ports backed up with containers. Truckers were in short supply. At the same time, demand shifted in unexpected ways. People who were stuck at home and couldn't spend money on restaurants, travel, and services instead spent money on goods, particularly home goods, electronics, and exercise equipment. The combination of constrained supply and redirected demand caused prices for certain categories of goods to rise sharply. Lumber prices in the United States tripled in the space of less than a year. The price of used cars, normally a fairly stable market, rose by 30 or 40%. Container shipping costs that had been a few $1,000s before the pandemic rose to tens of thousands of dollars for some routes. These weren't primarily caused by too much money in the economy, at least not at first. They were caused by the sudden, severe disruption of finely tuned systems that had been optimized for efficiency in normal times, but turned out to have little resilience when conditions were not normal. Now, it's worth stepping back and noting that supply chain disruptions typically cause temporary price spikes rather than permanent inflation. When the disruption resolves, prices often come back down, at least partially. The lumber prices that tripled eventually fell back toward more normal levels. Container shipping costs came back down over time. So supply chain shocks can cause a period of elevated prices, but they don't necessarily create the kind of self-sustaining inflation that can persist for years. What can turn a temporary price spike into sustained inflation is when those higher prices get embedded into wages and expectations in the way we discussed earlier. If the lumber price spike causes construction workers to successfully negotiate higher wages to cover their higher cost of living, and if the higher wages push up the cost of construction more generally, and if that feeds through to rents and other costs, then a supply shock that might have been temporary starts to look a lot more persistent. Let's take a moment to think about another dimension of this: one that is easy to overlook because it tends to happen slowly. Let's think about what happens to prices over very long periods of time, measured not in months or years but in decades. Over the past 100 years or so, the economies of the industrialized world have experienced very significant technological change. Methods of production have become dramatically more efficient in many areas. A single farmer using modern machinery can cultivate and harvest land that would have required dozens of workers a century ago. A single factory worker monitoring computerized equipment can produce in an hour what might have taken a skilled craftsman a day. The cost of making many physical goods has fallen enormously in real terms when you account for all these productivity gains. And yet, overall prices have still risen over this period. Inflation, measured at a low but steady rate in many developed countries through much of the 20th century, has compounded into very large cumulative price increases over time. Something that cost $1 in 1920 would cost something like $15 or $20 today, depending on the measure you use and what specific product you're thinking about. Why has inflation persisted even as technology has made production more efficient? Part of the answer is that not all sectors of the economy have experienced the same productivity gains. There are certain kinds of work, particularly work that involves human attention, skill, and personal interaction, that have proven much harder to make dramatically more efficient through technology. Healthcare is one example. Education is another. Personal care services, like haircuts, are a third. A haircut took roughly the same amount of time and skill in 1970 as it does today. A nurse can't care for dramatically more patients at once simply because technology has improved. A teacher cannot meaningfully double the number of students they're effectively educating without some degradation in quality. These services are constrained by the time and attention of skilled humans, and that doesn't get 10 times more efficient in the way that, say, semiconductor manufacturing has. But the people who provide these services live in the same economy as everyone else. They need housing, food, healthcare, and all the other things that have become more expensive over time. If their wages don't rise to keep up with the general cost of living, they'll leave those professions. So wages in labor-intensive service sectors tend to rise roughly in line with wages in the rest of the economy, even if the productivity of those sectors hasn't risen as fast. And when wages rise without a corresponding increase in productivity, costs go up, and prices tend to follow. This phenomenon, where productivity growth is uneven across the economy and causes the prices of low productivity sectors to rise relative to everything else, is sometimes called the Baumol effect, or Baumol's cost disease. It's one of the reasons that education, healthcare, and many services have tended to become more expensive relative to manufactured goods over time. And it's a structural force that operates continuously in the background of any modern economy, regardless of what monetary policy is doing. Let's keep moving and look at the role of housing, which is one of the most persistent and widely felt drivers of price increases for many people. Housing is unusual among the things that people buy because it combines several characteristics that make it particularly susceptible to price increases. It's a necessity. Almost everyone needs somewhere to live, and the demand for housing is therefore quite stable and somewhat inelastic, meaning that people will pay more for it rather than easily doing without. It's location-specific, which means that the supply of housing in a particular desirable place is strictly limited by geography and local zoning rules. It's durable, lasting for decades or centuries, which means that the total supply changes slowly even when lots of new construction is happening. And it's an asset as well as a consumption good, which means that people and institutions sometimes buy it not just to live in but as an investment. In cities where many people want to live, particularly cities with strong economies and lots of well-paying jobs, these characteristics have combined over the past several decades to push housing prices up sharply. San Francisco, London, New York, Sydney, Vancouver, and many other cities have seen housing costs rise dramatically, far faster than overall inflation, far faster than incomes for many residents. The supply of housing in these cities has not kept pace with demand for a variety of reasons. Building new housing in dense urban areas is genuinely difficult and expensive. Local zoning laws, often shaped by the preferences of existing homeowners who don't want more density in their neighborhoods, restrict how much and what kind of housing can be built. Construction costs have risen. Permitting and regulatory processes take time. And so, faced with a growing number of people who want to live in the city and a relatively fixed supply of places to live, prices have been bid up. When housing costs represent a large and growing fraction of people's spending, as they do for many urban residents today, rent increases effectively function as inflation for those people, even when the official inflation statistics may look moderate. The experience of inflation is always somewhat personal, depending on what you actually spend your money on. Someone who rents an apartment in a rapidly appreciating city and has a long commute feels inflation in their housing and transportation costs very acutely. Someone who owns their home and walks to work may feel it much less, even if the official numbers are the same. Let's drift a little further back in time, to the period when modern central banking was taking shape, and look at how the institutions that manage money and interest rates came to exist. In medieval Europe, lending money at interest was actually prohibited or at least heavily discouraged by the Catholic Church, on the grounds that it was a form of usury, the sin of profiting from the passage of time. This prohibition was not entirely absolute or universally enforced, and Jewish merchants were sometimes allowed to lend at interest to Christians since the prohibition in Christian theology did not apply to them in the same way, leading to a complicated and often ugly history. But the official disapproval of lending at interest did shape the financial institutions of the early medieval period. As trade expanded, particularly in the Italian city-states beginning in the 11th and 12th centuries, the need for sophisticated financial instruments grew rapidly. Merchants needed to transfer money across long distances without carrying it physically, which was dangerous. They needed credit to finance shipments that might take months to arrive. They needed ways to share risk across multiple investors. All of this gave rise to the banking houses of Florence, Venice, Genoa, and other cities. The Medici Bank, founded in the 14th century, became one of the most powerful financial institutions in Europe, with branches across the continent and sophisticated methods for transferring credit without physically moving gold. These early banks did not directly control the money supply in the way a central bank does, but they were intermediaries that connected people who had money and didn't immediately need it with people who needed money and could pay it back later. By lending out deposited funds, they were effectively multiplying the money supply. A depositor who put 100 gold coins in the bank still thought of those coins as his, but the bank was meanwhile lending 80 of them to a merchant, who used them to pay for goods, which put them back into circulation. The same coins were, in a sense, doing two jobs at once. This practice, which is the essence of what we now call fractional reserve banking, has profound implications for the money supply and for inflation. It means that the total amount of money functioning in an economy is not simply the amount of gold or silver or other base money in existence. It's also all the deposits and credit created by the banking system on top of that base. And the amount of credit the banking system creates can fluctuate significantly depending on how confident banks are about lending and how confident borrowers are about borrowing. When banks are lending freely and businesses are borrowing to invest and expand, the effective money supply swells. When fear spreads and banks become cautious and loans are called in, the effective money supply contracts. These swings in credit creation are one of the reasons that economies experience cycles of expansion and contraction, booms and recessions. And they matter for inflation. A rapid expansion of credit, even without any change in the underlying supply of gold or silver or government-issued currency, can push up prices by putting more purchasing power into circulation. A contraction of credit can depress prices by withdrawing purchasing power. Central banks, when they eventually emerge, were partly an attempt to bring some stability and coordination to this otherwise quite chaotic process. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, is often cited as the first modern central bank, though it didn't perform all the functions we associate with central banks today for quite some time. It was originally set up to lend money to the government, which needed funds to fight wars with France. In exchange for providing this lending, the bank received certain privileges, including the right to issue banknotes, paper certificates that represented claims on gold held in the bank's vaults. These banknotes were a significant innovation. A merchant could carry a piece of paper in his coat pocket that represented 100 pounds of gold, without having to actually lug the gold around. The note was easier to carry, easier to divide, and easier to use in transactions. As long as people trusted that the Bank of England would actually give them the gold if they showed up with the note, the notes were as good as gold for most purposes. And this is where we arrive at a crucial concept: the relationship between paper money and the things backing it. For most of the period when paper money existed alongside gold and silver coinage, there was a direct link between the paper and the metal. In theory, if you had a banknote, you could take it to the bank and get real gold in exchange. This is called a gold standard, and it was the dominant framework for international monetary arrangements for much of the 19th century and into the 20th. Under the gold standard, the amount of currency in circulation was effectively capped by the amount of gold a government held in reserve. You couldn't just print more money than you had gold to back, at least not in principle. This put a natural brake on inflation, since you couldn't expand the money supply without acquiring more gold. But it also created other problems. The supply of gold in the world grows slowly and somewhat unpredictably, determined by where new deposits are discovered and how easy they are to mine. If the economy is growing quickly, it might need more money to facilitate all the new transactions happening, but if gold isn't growing at the same pace, you could end up with a money supply that's too tight for the economy's needs. This can lead to deflation, falling prices, which has its own set of problems. Deflation might sound like a good thing at first, since prices going down means things are cheaper. But sustained deflation creates a perverse incentive to hold on to money rather than spend it, since tomorrow money will buy more than it does today. If everyone delays their purchases waiting for prices to fall further, demand collapses, businesses suffer, workers get laid off, and you end up in a downward spiral that can be very difficult to stop. The Great Depression of the 1930s is in part a story about deflation and the catastrophic effects it can have when it becomes self-reinforcing. The gold standard was progressively weakened and eventually abandoned through the mid-20th century. The last significant connection between the US dollar and gold was severed in 1971 when President Nixon ended the convertibility of dollars to gold at a fixed price, a moment sometimes called the Nixon shock. After that point, the dollar and most other major currencies became what are called fiat currencies, meaning they have no direct backing in any physical commodity. Their value rests entirely on the trust and authority of the government that issues them, and the willingness of people to accept them in exchange for goods and services. The word fiat is Latin for let it be done, or it shall be. A fiat currency is money because the government says it is, and because everyone in society has agreed to treat it as such. The removal of the gold constraint opened up both opportunities and risks. On the opportunity side, central banks now had much more flexibility to manage the money supply in response to economic conditions. They could expand the supply of money during a recession to stimulate spending and employment, without being constrained by how much gold they had in their vaults. They could cut interest rates, making borrowing cheaper, to encourage investment. They could use various tools to stabilize the economy in ways that were simply not possible under a rigid gold standard. On the risk side, the constraint that had prevented governments from inflating away their debts or printing money to fund wars and projects was now gone. The discipline would have to come from institutions and conventions rather than from a physical limit. And as we've seen in various countries throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, when those institutional constraints break down, the results can be very dramatic. Let's take a moment to look at what hyperinflation actually looks like, since it represents the most extreme end of the price-rising spectrum and helps clarify what the tamer versions of inflation are dancing around. Germany in the early 1920s is probably the most frequently cited historical example of hyperinflation, though it's far from the only one. In the years following World War I, Germany owed enormous reparations payments to the Allied powers. Its economy had been devastated by the war. It had lost territory, its merchant fleet, and significant industrial capacity. The German government was struggling to fund its ongoing operations while also servicing this crushing external debt. Faced with these impossible demands, the German government increasingly resorted to printing money. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, expanded the money supply rapidly to finance government spending. And in 1923, the situation escalated into one of the most dramatic episodes of currency collapse in modern history. Prices in Germany in 1923 were rising so fast that workers would demand to be paid twice a day, in the morning and at noon, so they could rush to spend their wages before inflation had eroded their value further by afternoon. Women reportedly brought laundry baskets to collect their wages, not purses. Photographs from the period show workers loading wheelbarrows full of banknotes just to buy basic groceries. The German government eventually issued notes, with face values in the billions and trillions of marks. By November 1923, the exchange rate between the German mark and the US dollar had reached $1 trillion to 1. Things that had cost 1 mark in 1913 cost roughly $1 trillion marks 10 years later. The social and economic devastation this caused was enormous. People who had saved money for their entire lives found their savings wiped out. Fixed income earners, pensioners, and creditors were effectively ruined. The middle class, which had been the backbone of German society, was economically destroyed, and the social trauma of this experience contributed in ways that historians still debate to the political instability that followed. The German hyperinflation was resolved through the introduction of a new currency, the Rentenmark, which was backed by a claim on German land and industrial assets, combined with severe restrictions on the Reichsbank's ability to print money. The combination of a credible new currency and a believable commitment to restraint in money printing was enough to stabilize prices relatively quickly, which itself illustrates something important. Inflation, even very severe inflation, is ultimately a story about trust and expectations. When people believe the currency will hold its value, they behave accordingly, and it tends to. When they stop believing, the self-fulfilling logic of inflation becomes very hard to stop. More recent examples of hyperinflation include Zimbabwe in the 2000s, Venezuela in the 2010s, and various other episodes throughout the 20th century, usually in countries dealing with extreme political instability, unsustainable government spending, or external shocks that destroyed the economy's productive capacity. In all of these cases, the common thread is a breakdown in the discipline of money creation and the trust that underpins any currency's value. Let's come back to more familiar territory and think about the more moderate, chronic, everyday inflation that most people in stable developed countries have lived with for most of the past century. The consensus target for inflation in most developed economies today is around 2% per year. This might seem like a very specific number, and it is. It wasn't arrived at through any particular economic theory that says 2% is uniquely optimal. It emerged through a combination of practical experience and convention. New Zealand was actually one of the first countries to formally adopt a 2% inflation target in the late 1980s, and others followed. The reasoning behind targeting a positive but low rate of inflation rather than zero is nuanced and worth sitting with for a moment. Zero inflation sounds appealing in principle, but it comes with risks. If inflation is exactly zero and then some negative shock hits the economy, prices can easily tip into deflation, with all the problems that entails. Having a small buffer of positive inflation means that there's room to maneuver before you hit the deflationary danger zone. It also means that even if wages can't fall in nominal terms, which workers tend to resist strongly, they can effectively fall in real terms if inflation slightly outpaces nominal wage growth, giving employers some flexibility during difficult periods. Central banks use several tools to influence inflation. The most important is the interest rate, specifically the short-term interest rate at which banks can borrow from the central bank. When the central bank raises this rate, borrowing becomes more expensive throughout the economy. Mortgages cost more. Business loans cost more. Credit card rates go up. All of this tends to reduce borrowing and spending, which cools demand and puts downward pressure on prices. When the central bank lowers rates, the opposite happens. Borrowing becomes cheaper, spending and investment tend to increase, and the economy heats up. Raising interest rates to fight inflation has real costs, because it also tends to slow economic growth and can push up unemployment. This is the fundamental tension that central bankers navigate. Inflation too high is harmful, but the medicine to cure it, higher interest rates and slower growth, is also painful. Finding the right level, the right timing, the right balance, is more art than science, and central bankers frequently get it wrong in both directions. In the decade following the 2008 financial crisis, central banks in the United States and Europe kept interest rates near zero, or even negative, in some cases, for an extended period, partly to stimulate sluggish economies recovering from the crisis. This was a remarkable and historically unusual experiment in monetary policy. For years, inflation stayed subdued despite very low rates, partly because the financial crisis had damaged the credit creation mechanism of the banking system, and partly because global trade continued to put downward pressure on the prices of goods. Then, in 2021 and 2022, inflation rose sharply in the United States and many other countries, reaching levels not seen in decades. The causes were multiple and intertwined. The pandemic had disrupted supply chains. Fiscal stimulus programs had put significant amounts of money in consumers' hands at a time when there was less to buy with it. Energy prices rose sharply. Food prices were affected by the war in Ukraine, which disrupted agricultural exports from a region that supplies a significant share of the world's wheat and cooking oil. And years of near-zero interest rates, combined with the fiscal stimulus, had created conditions that made demand pull inflation more likely even before the supply shocks hit. Central banks responded by raising interest rates quickly and significantly, the fastest rate hiking cycle in decades in some cases. Whether the initial inflation was primarily demand-driven or supply-driven, and whether the policy response was well-calibrated or too aggressive, became the subject of significant debate among economists. The answers are still being worked out, and will probably be debated in economic journals for years to come. What this episode illustrated, among other things, was how unusual the previous decade of very low inflation had been, and how quickly conditions can shift. The mechanisms that keep prices stable are robust in normal times, but can be destabilized when multiple unusual things happen at once. Let's step back again and look at the way prices affect different groups of people differently, because this is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of inflation. We sometimes talk about inflation as if it's a uniform experience, a single number that everyone in an economy experiences in the same way. But in practice, different people experience very different rates of price change depending on what they buy, where they live, and what they own. Someone who rents their home, commutes by car, buys a lot of food, and has limited savings tends to be hit harder by inflation than someone who owns their home, works from home, grows some of their own food, and holds significant financial assets. The homeowner benefits from the fact that their home's value tends to rise with inflation, while their mortgage payment stays fixed. The renter has no such buffer. Older people on fixed pensions are often more exposed to inflation than working-age people, since their income is set in nominal terms while their expenses rise. Young people trying to enter the housing market are severely affected by rising home prices in a way that established homeowners are not, even though both are technically experiencing the same housing inflation. These distributional effects are not incidental to the economics of inflation. They are central to understanding why inflation tends to be politically contentious, why policy debates about how to manage it are often actually debates about whose interests to prioritize, and why the same economic statistics can produce very different visceral experiences for different people. There's also a dimension that connects inflation to wealth versus income in a more structural way. Inflation tends over time to transfer value from creditors to debtors. If you have borrowed money and inflation rises, you get to pay back your debt in money that's worth less than it was when you borrowed it. The real burden of your debt shrinks. This benefits anyone who has borrowed, including homeowners with mortgages and governments with large public debts. It hurts anyone who has lent money at a fixed interest rate, since they receive back money that buys less than what they originally lent. In a world where wealthy people tend to own assets that appreciate in value during inflationary periods, and where poorer people tend to hold their wealth in cash or receive fixed nominal incomes, moderate inflation can sometimes have redistributive effects that widen inequality over time, though this is complicated and depends heavily on the specific context. These are slow, structural tendencies rather than sharp, obvious effects. They operate over years and decades, and they're often invisible to the people experiencing them, which is part of what makes them interesting and somewhat unsettling to think about. Let's slow down a bit more now and spend some time with a question that has a certain quiet depth to it. Why does money lose value at all? What is the mechanism by which the institutions and people who control money supply end up creating more of it? The simple answer is that governments and central banks create money because it's useful for them to do so. Governments that need to spend more than they collect in taxes have to borrow, and if they borrow heavily enough for long enough, one way or another, the money supply tends to expand. Central banks that are trying to stimulate economic activity lower interest rates and, in recent decades, have also engaged in direct purchases of financial assets, which effectively puts more money into the financial system. These actions have various economic rationales, some more valid than others, but they share a tendency to expand the supply of money over time. The slightly deeper answer connects to something fundamental about the incentives of political systems. Inflation is, in a sense, a form of invisible taxation. If a government is spending money it doesn't have and is effectively financing that spending by inflating the currency, it is extracting real resources from the holders of money by eroding the value of their savings. Unlike a normal tax, this happens without any explicit political decision to tax anyone. It's diffuse, invisible, and distributed across everyone who holds or uses money. This makes it politically easier to implement than explicit taxes, though in the long run, sustained inflation tends to provoke political backlash when people figure out what's happening. Historically, this has been a recurring pattern. Governments facing fiscal pressure have found ways to expand the money supply, whether by debasing coins, printing paper money, or manipulating interest rates, and the result has been price increases that impose real costs on ordinary people. The Roman denarius, the German Reichsmark, the Zimbabwean dollar. These are all stories, at some level, of this same pattern. The institutional structures we've built over the past century or two, independent central banks with explicit price stability mandates, formal inflation targeting regimes, and so on, are attempts to resist this tendency. They've been reasonably successful in many countries for extended periods. But they're not perfectly insulated from political pressure, and the history of central bank independence is also a history of ongoing tension between the technocratic logic of price stability and the political pressures that push toward easier money. There's another thread worth pulling on gently, one that operates over very long time periods. The relationship between demographic change and inflation. For most of the past century in developed countries, the population of working-age adults was growing. Baby booms followed World War II in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere, producing large cohorts of people who entered the workforce in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. These workers were productive. They were also consumers who spent money on housing, cars, appliances, and all the other things that growing families need. They saved for retirement through pension funds and investment accounts. Their large numbers helped both to supply goods and services to the economy and to demand them. Now, in many developed countries, that demographic pattern has reversed. Birth rates have fallen. The large baby boom generation has moved into retirement, leaving the workforce and drawing down savings rather than accumulating them. Younger cohorts are smaller. Immigration fills some of the gap in some countries, but not all. The workforce in many places is growing more slowly or even shrinking. Some economists argue that demographic aging creates deflationary pressures, as retirees spend less and as a shrinking workforce reduces productive capacity. Japan is often cited as a case study here, given its aging population and its experience of persistent low inflation or even deflation over recent decades. Others argue that the relationship is more complex and that aging populations can actually be inflationary in some ways, particularly in healthcare costs, which tend to rise as populations get older. The full effects of demographic change on inflation are still being worked out theoretically and empirically, and different countries are at different stages of the transition. But it's a reminder that inflation, like so many economic phenomena, is not simply a monetary story. It's also a demographic story, a productivity story, a trade story, and a political story. All of these threads are woven together. Let's drift towards something more concrete again, and think about specific categories of prices and why they behave differently. We mentioned earlier that healthcare, education, and housing have all tended to rise faster than general inflation over recent decades, while manufactured goods and many technology products have actually fallen in price in real terms or stayed roughly stable. A smartphone today, adjusted for inflation and for the vastly greater capabilities it has compared to phones of 10 or 15 years ago, is in some sense dramatically cheaper per unit of functionality than its predecessors. The same is true for computers, televisions, and many other electronics. The reason is that these products have been subject to relentless technological improvement and international competition, which has consistently driven down the cost per unit of performance. Moore's law, the empirical observation that the number of transistors on a microchip tends to roughly double every 2 years or so, has meant that computing power has become exponentially cheaper over time, even as the nominal price of devices has stayed roughly stable or declined. Food prices, adjusted for inflation, have also fallen substantially over the past century in many countries, thanks to dramatic improvements in agricultural productivity, better seeds, fertilizers, irrigation, mechanization, and global trade. The proportion of income that the average person in a wealthy country spends on food has declined significantly over the past 100 years, even as diets have in many respects improved in variety and abundance. These deflating sectors are a quiet counterbalance to the sectors that are inflating. When people complain about the cost of living, they're usually thinking about housing, healthcare, and education, the things that have become dramatically more expensive. They may not be as aware of all the things that have become dramatically cheaper or stayed about the same, because the things that don't hurt don't register as vividly. Official inflation statistics try to capture this full picture by tracking prices across a basket of goods and services meant to represent what typical consumers actually buy. But the composition of that basket, and whose typical spending it reflects, involves a lot of methodological choices that can significantly affect the measured rate of inflation. Whether and how to adjust for improvements in quality, which is called the hedonics adjustment, whether to include housing prices or just rents, how to weight different categories, all of these choices are genuinely difficult, and different approaches produce meaningfully different numbers. This is not a conspiracy or a cover-up. It's just the inherent difficulty of measuring something as complex and multidimensional as the overall price level in a large economy. But it does mean that the single number we see reported as the inflation rate is an abstraction that inevitably smooths over a lot of variation in lived experience. Let's let the complexity settle there for a moment, and come back to one of the oldest and simplest questions at the heart of all of this. What is money worth, really? It's a question that sounds philosophical but has very practical implications. And the answer that economists tend to give is, Money is worth whatever people believe it is worth, no more and no less. This sounds circular, but it's actually quite profound. The value of a $20 bill is not determined by the paper it's printed on, which is worth almost nothing. It's not determined by any physical commodity backing it. It's determined by the collective social agreement that it can be used to buy things. That agreement is maintained by trust in the institutions that issue the currency, by the stability of the legal and economic system in which it circulates, and by the simple habit and convention of using it. When trust in those institutions erodes, as it did in Weimar Germany and Zimbabwe, the value of the currency erodes too. When trust is strong and stable, so is the currency's value. This means that the story of inflation is, at its deepest level, a story about trust. Trust in institutions. Trust in the future. Trust that the social agreements underlying our monetary system will hold. There's something almost meditative about that realization. The number on a price tag, which can feel so concrete and real, so fixed and obvious, is actually resting on this vast web of trust and social convention that stretches back thousands of years. The merchant in ancient Babylon agreeing to a price in silver. The medieval banker in Florence issuing a letter of credit. The central banker in Washington or Frankfurt or Tokyo setting an interest rate. All of these are acts of maintaining and extending a shared fiction, a shared agreement about what things are worth. And prices rise ultimately when something disrupts that agreement, or when the supply of the thing used to represent value grows faster than the things it's meant to measure. All of the specific mechanisms we've discussed, debasement of coins, government money printing, supply chain disruptions, oil shocks, demographic shifts, the Baumol effect, expectations and wage price spirals, are just different ways in which that basic relationship between money and value gets pushed out of balance. Sometimes temporarily, sometimes for a long time, and always with real effects on the lives of real people. There's a certain patience required to understand inflation well. It's not a single thing with a single cause. It's a cluster of related phenomena, connected at the root but branching out in many different directions depending on the context. Understanding it requires holding several different ideas in mind at once: the quantity of money, the speed at which it moves, the structure of production and supply chains, the psychology of expectations, the institutional frameworks for managing monetary policy, the distributional effects across different groups, and the long, slow forces of demography and technology. None of these ideas is, by itself, too difficult to grasp. Each one makes a kind of intuitive sense once you've spent a little time with it. The challenge is holding them all together and understanding how they interact, which is why inflation has been studied seriously by some of the best minds in economics for well over 200 years and still generates significant debate. Let's think for a moment about some of the economists and thinkers who have shaped our understanding of these things, not because we need to assign credit or memorize names, but because the history of economic thinking about prices is itself a gentle and interesting story. Adam Smith, writing in 1776, was one of the first systematic thinkers about the workings of markets and prices. His great work, The Wealth of Nations, explored how the price of goods in a market tends to gravitate toward the cost of producing them, and how competition among sellers keeps prices from rising too far above those costs. He was writing at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, a period when the nature of work and production were changing rapidly, and his observations still resonate in many ways. David Hume, Smith's friend and predecessor, wrote important essays on money and inflation in the mid-18th century. He observed the relationship between the quantity of money and the level of prices and articulated early versions of the quantity theory that Martin de Azpilcueta had sketched 2 centuries before. Hume also understood that the relationship was not instantaneous, that there were adjustment processes and time lags, which is something that has proven crucial to understanding how modern monetary policy actually works. David Ricardo, writing in the early 19th century, developed a sophisticated framework for understanding international trade and the distribution of income, and wrote about the effects of paper money on prices. Ricardo was one of the architects of the gold standard as a policy framework, believing that anchoring money to a fixed quantity of metal was the best way to ensure stable prices over time. Karl Marx, coming from a very different political tradition, also wrote extensively about money and prices, though his concerns were primarily with the social relations of production rather than with monetary policy per se. His concept of surplus value and his analysis of how capitalist economies generate profit, while deeply contested, contributed to the understanding of how costs and prices are related to the underlying conditions of labor and production. Alfred Marshall in the late 19th century developed much of the formal apparatus of supply and demand analysis that economists still use today, including the idea of elasticity, how responsive demand or supply is to changes in price. His work was foundational for understanding how markets set prices and how disruptions to supply or demand transmit through to prices. Irving Fisher, an American economist writing in the early 20th century, was one of the most influential proponents of the quantity theory of money, formalizing it into the equation MV equals PQ, where M is the money supply, V is the velocity of money, P is the price level, and Q is the quantity of goods and services produced. This simple identity, often called the equation of exchange, has been a foundational tool for thinking about inflation ever since, even though interpreting and applying it in practice is much more complicated than the formula suggests. John Maynard Keynes, writing in the 1930s and 1940s, developed a framework for understanding how economies could get stuck in situations of high unemployment and low growth even when prices were falling. His analysis led to the conclusion that in some circumstances, active government spending, even if it meant running deficits, could be necessary to restore economic activity. His ideas reshaped economic policy for decades after World War II. Keynes was also deeply interested in the nature of money and wrote about inflation in ways that emphasized its distributional effects and its relationship to debt. Milton Friedman, working mainly in the latter half of the 20th century, was the most influential critic of the Keynesian consensus. His famous statement that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon was a deliberate challenge to frameworks that emphasized structural, or real factors. Friedman argued that sustained inflation was ultimately a result of excessive money creation, and that central banks needed to maintain strict control over money supply growth to keep inflation low. His ideas were very influential in reshaping central bank policy from the late 1970s onward. More recent thinkers have complicated this picture in various ways. Economists studying the behavior of wages and prices in labor markets have found that the relationship between unemployment and inflation, once thought to be fairly stable and predictable, shifts significantly over time and across different economic conditions. Researchers have explored how the global integration of supply chains affects prices in ways that domestic monetary policy can't fully control. Behavioral economists have looked at how psychological factors and biases affect both individual pricing decisions and collective inflation dynamics. The understanding of inflation continues to evolve. Each new episode, whether it's the Great Inflation of the 1970s, the prolonged low inflation of the 2010s, or the sharp spike of the early 2020s, adds new data and new puzzles to work through. There's something almost comforting about the fact that this very old question, why do prices rise, is still generating new insights and new debates among some of the best economic minds alive today. It suggests that the question is genuinely deep, genuinely connected to fundamental aspects of how human societies organize their economic lives, and genuinely not fully resolved. Let's slow down even further now and think about the experience of everyday life through the lens of slowly rising prices. Imagine, if you like, following the arc of a single price across a long period of time. Take the price of a postage stamp in the United States, which is a fairly easy one to track historically. In 1960, a first-class stamp cost 4 cents. By 1980 it cost 15 cents. By 2000 it cost 33 cents. By 2020 it cost 55 cents. As of a few years ago, it had crossed 60 cents. These numbers, traced out over 60 years, tell a quiet story of persistent, moderate inflation. The price has roughly tripled since the year 2000 and has risen by a factor of about 15 since 1960. Someone who was alive in 1960 and is still alive today has watched the price of a stamp grow from something you could cover with the copper coins in your pocket to something that requires you to think about whether you have the right denomination. And yet, adjusted for inflation, the real cost of mailing a letter has stayed roughly similar over most of this period, because wages and incomes have also risen substantially over those 60 years. The nominal price has gone up, but the relative burden of that price, measured in minutes of work required to earn enough to buy a stamp, hasn't changed as dramatically as the raw number suggests. This is actually one of the most important points about inflation that often gets lost in the emotional response to seeing higher prices. Inflation, when it's moderate and matched by corresponding rises in wages, is not necessarily a sign that life is becoming worse. It's largely a sign that the nominal measuring stick is changing while the underlying real relationships stay roughly similar. The problem, and it's a real one, is when inflation is not matched by wage increases for particular groups. When prices rise faster than the wages of certain workers, particularly lower-paid workers, the real standard of living for those people genuinely falls. When the categories of spending that most affect lower-income households, housing, food, healthcare, rise faster than overall inflation and faster than their wages, the squeeze is real and meaningful. So inflation, in the end, is both a monetary phenomenon and a distributional one. It's both about the overall price level and about who gains and who loses as that level shifts. Let's think about what it feels like to live through an inflationary period in a very ordinary, everyday way. You notice it first in the things you buy most frequently, because those are the prices most present in your memory. Groceries, gas, coffee. You have a rough mental model of what these things should cost, built up from hundreds of purchases over time. When the price at the register doesn't match your mental model, you feel a small jar, a slight sense of dissonance. Not dramatic. Just a quiet note of something being different. Over time, if prices continue to rise, you update your mental model. $40 at the grocery store starts to feel normal where $30 used to. And then $50. The new price becomes the new baseline, and the dissonance fades until the next round of increases. This gradual adjustment of expectations is itself an important part of the inflation dynamic. It's one of the ways that moderate inflation can persist without causing visible crisis. People's sense of what things should cost keeps pace with what things do cost, and the constant readjustment is invisible because it happens in small increments. What tends to make inflation noticeable and disruptive is when the pace of adjustment exceeds the comfortable processing speed. When prices are rising faster than people can calmly update their expectations and budgets. This was part of what made the inflation of 2021 and 2022 feel so jarring to many people, even though by historical standards it was not extreme. It happened more quickly than most people had experienced in their lifetimes, and it required a faster and more uncomfortable adjustment than the slow background hum of 2% annual inflation that had been the norm for decades. There's a concept in psychology sometimes used in economic contexts called money illusion. The tendency to think about money in nominal terms rather than real terms. To see a price of $10 as somehow intrinsically $10-ish, rather than recognizing that $10 in one decade buys very different amounts than $10 in another decade. Most people, most of the time, experience at least some degree of money illusion. We anchor on nominal numbers. We remember what things used to cost in nominal terms. We feel the pain of paying more even if, adjusting for inflation and wage growth, we're not meaningfully worse off. This psychological dimension of inflation is not irrational, exactly. Nominal prices are what you actually see on the shelf and on the receipt. They're the numbers you deal with in your daily life. But it does mean that the subjective experience of inflation can be more painful and provoke stronger reactions than the underlying economics might strictly warrant. And those strong reactions feed back into political decisions about how to respond, which in turn affects the trajectory of inflation itself. We've traveled quite a distance now, from the quiet observation of a slightly higher price at the checkout, back through central banking and the gold standard, through the silver mines of Potosí and the debasement of the Roman denarius, through commodity money and barter and the earliest human economies. We've traced the threads of monetary inflation and cost-push inflation and demographic change and supply chain disruption and expectations and distributional effects. All of it connects, in one way or another, to that simplest of questions: why is this thing more expensive than it used to be? And the answer, which is not one answer but many woven together, is that the relationship between the measuring stick and what it measures is never perfectly stable. The social agreements that money represents are strong but not immutable. The supply of goods and the supply of money grow at different rates in different periods. The costs of producing things change as technology and resources and labor markets shift. The expectations and behaviors of millions of people interact in ways that can amplify or dampen price movements far beyond what any central authority intends or controls. Prices rise in the end because we live in a dynamic world, one where things change, where the balance between supply and demand is always being disrupted and re-established, where the value of money is always being renegotiated, quietly and continuously, in every transaction that takes place every day. There's something almost restful about understanding this, in a way. The rising price of a loaf of bread is not a mystery or a malfunction. It's a signal, imperfect and noisy but real, about the shifting relationships between what we produce, what we consume, and how much of the social agreement called money is floating around to mediate those exchanges. It's been happening for thousands of years, in every society that has ever developed a monetary economy. It will probably continue to happen, in one form or another, for as long as such economies exist. The goal is not to stop prices from ever rising, which would be impossible and probably undesirable. The goal is to understand the forces at work, to manage them with enough wisdom and humility to prevent the extreme episodes, and to distribute the unavoidable burdens of moderate inflation as fairly as possible across the people who make up an economy. That's a goal that requires patience and knowledge and the kind of slow, careful attention to detail that doesn't make headlines but matters enormously over time. And now, after this long, slow journey through the history and mechanics of rising prices, through ancient commodity money and central bank policy and supply chain disruptions and the psychology of expectations, you might find that the subject feels a little less opaque than it did at the start. Not fully resolved, because it never fully is, but a little clearer, a little more connected to itself and to the larger story of how human beings have organized the exchange of things they need and want. The world outside is the same as it was when you started listening. But perhaps the prices in it, whatever they are when next you encounter them, will carry a little more quiet history with them. A little more of the long, slow story of what money is and does, and why the measuring stick that we use to talk about value keeps, gently and persistently, getting a little shorter. That's all there is to say for now. Let the ideas drift as they will. Some of them will settle and stay. Others will float away, and that's fine too. The slow erosion of any single night's listening is just another kind of inflation, the gradual change of what's in your mind from one day to the next. And perhaps that's not such a bad way to think about it. Rest well.